Hello everyone and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. This video is going to be a story retrospective on the main campaign of Dragalia Lost. I'll be sharing my top 10 moments from the main campaign in this video, so full spoilers ahead for everything that happened from Chapter 1 all the way to Chapter 26, the very end of the campaign. Because of course we're here at the end of service for Dragalia Lost, just a couple days left before the game shuts down, so I wanted to make this video to reflect on all the good times, think about the story more as a whole now that we have all of it. Actually, we got all of it back in July, but of course it took me a while to finally play through and get that clear on the final boss. I posted that video fairly recently. So this will be my story retrospective, and right off the bat, what's on screen now, these are actually not scenes from the main campaign, so no spoilers leaked in the thumbnail of this video. These are scenes that are all from different raid events. So on the left, that picture of Ilya is from Forgotten Truths. Then in the center, the picture of Yuden and Zethia is from Advent of the Origin. And on the right, the image of Alberius is from Dawn of Dragalia. So to be clear, this will be focused on story moments in the main campaign. Of course, all the events have some good story beats of their own, but I did just make a separate video about my favorite events, so I covered a few of those in there. As always, we'll start off with some honorable mentions. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things here in the honorable mentions, and specifically these two moments in which certain characters' power-ups were introduced, and it was pretty clear that we were going to get a Gala alt for them based on their powered up state. First up, a very wholesome moment with my favorite character in the main cast, Not. It's Chapter 18, Part 5-3, Into the Future. This is the first appearance of Mega Not. It's when she gets her special transform state just to save the day. I just remember that being a really, really fun moment in the main campaign, and I was so happy for her as a prominent character. She later, in subsequent chapters, makes a couple key saves too, using her powered up form, so it wasn't just that moment of metamorphosis, but what followed that was pretty exciting. And on the right, a more humorous transformation in aptly named, or perhaps ironically named, Chapter 23, 3-6, Despair. In this one, Gala Emil is saving the day from Xenos in the wake of the Satan incident in Grams. And just the way they introduce him, rallying the rabble, talking about his lack of talent, but that's actually what makes him special. Just everything about this and how he kind of kicked Yuden into shape in the subsequent parts of that chapter. I really thought this was a really funny and fitting introduction for a character that actually ended up being a pretty powerful Gala unit. A joke character for the longest, a joke villain, but ended up being a pretty good brother in the end. So those are my two honorable mentions. The rest of the top 10, I'm just going to share in story order. So it's not necessarily in a particular order of what things I like the most. I'm just going to start with the things that were earliest in the story and end up with the things that were latest in the story. So starting off with number 10, we have Chapter 1, 4-6, Shard and Shadow. And so this is from the very first chapter of the main campaign. I wanted to highlight this chapter for a couple different reasons. One, I think that those first 6 chapters of Dragalia Lost, because they all dropped simultaneously at launch, they do kind of blur together a little bit. But this chapter, Chapter 1, is so memorable because it's really what sets the whole story into motion. And in particular, in 4-6, the party discovers the Halidom, so that's the image on the left where we're in the Misthold, we discover the Halidom, that's going to become our base of operations. We also have this scene in the center where we arrive at a sacred shard that we've been sent out to fetch, and to me that image is just so iconic. I think I associate that from even like before the release of the game or around the release of the game. Just that image looking at the Sacred Shard with some of our main party members, including Cleo, Zethia, Yuden, and Not. And then, of course, Aurelius appears on the right, but not the Aurelius we know, our father, but rather an Aurelius who has been corrupted by the other. And also in this chapter, there's a special 3D cutscene where Yuden becomes Elysium in order to momentarily fend off the other possessed Aurelius. Ultimately, he transforms back, and Zethia voluntarily goes with Aurelius, mainly to protect the rest of the crew. But essentially, Zethia leaving the party is what sets into motion the whole chain of events of the rest of the story, so I had to highlight this here as one of my favorite moments. I think that it just gives me a lot of nostalgia for how simple the early arcs of Dragalia Lost were, and yet even from Chapter 1, there were characters like Otherworld Zethia or Zaina being introduced. There was that appearance for a brief moment of Elysium in that transformation of Yuden, so it does seem like some of the later plot points were seeded very much from the beginning of the campaign. Alright, so let's move on to next on my list. I guess you could say number 9 if we're counting down. So this is from Chapter 5, 4-1. The chapter name, or that section name, is Zethia. And you can tell by all the images from this chapter, this one was densely packed with these story scenes. And for me, these portrait or full art images are some of the most memorable moments and most exciting moments in the story. When the music would kick in, you would get one of these full arts. It was a real turning point or a real exciting moment in the story because most of the story is told through character portraits and somewhat static dialogue. There is voice acting in the Japanese version as well, but if you're playing with the English audio, that's not always the case. So anyway, Chapter 5, 4-1, Zethia. This was the section in which the party has caught up with Zethia and Aurelius. Zethia and Zaina strike against Aurelius and try to subdue the other, but the other Aurelius get away, and so does Zethia. They finally catch up with them, and you see Zethia kind of battling against Aurelius in the top left there. But little does our party know that the other actually now possesses Yuden. So Aurelius, who is now pure of heart, tries to protect Yuden, saying that, yeah, that Zethia you're trying to save, that's not the Zethia you actually know. In the process, Aurelius dies, and Yuden ends up forming a pact with Zodiark. You can see that kind of in the bottom right there. So overall, pretty sad moment in the story. And it's not that chapters 2, 3, and 4 were uneventful. They were also pretty fun and exciting. But like I said, that early part of the story sort of blurs together. This whole arc was about Yuden forming bonds with different Great Worms. So this was the climax in which he had already formed a bond with Midgardsormr, Mercury, Brunhilde, and Jupiter, and now also with Zodiark. And after this, Zethia becomes Empress. She is possessed by the other, and ultimately it's Zaina who saves the party by whisking them away. And we'll see that saving the party at the last minute is actually something that happens pretty often throughout the various plot points in Dragalia Lost. But all in all, that nothing personnel kid moment in this chapter, Aurelius sadly passing away and transferring his will in the form of Zodiark to Yuden, I just thought that this is one that I had to mention. So let's move on to number 8, and that is Chapter 10, 6-1 to 6-3, and the name of the chapter is Resurgent Despair. This chapter is set in Clav Loyalune, and it's all about sort of learning the history of the Second War of Binding, what happened 300 years ago. It's the resting place of Alberius, the founder of Alberia and ancestor to the royal family, and said to be the site of a battle between Alberius and the other Morsayadi. So Empress Zethia, possessed by the other, or by Morsayadi, heads to this site and basically is set out to try kind of resurrect themselves fully or reclaim their full power. We also learn in this chapter, in these several story segments, the details of how Alberius fell in battle against the other. So Alberius unleashed a forbidden technique known as the Blood Casket, essentially sealing away his soul as well as the other soul in kind of an eternal purgatory type state, if you will. we do get to actually converse with Alberius. He gets to meet his descendants, as there's sort of a fragment of him left with Chthonius, who we get to battle in this chapter. The Chthonius boss was something that, for me, was very exciting in this chapter, just because it's an original boss battle. We had an earlier boss battle, chapter 6, against Valix, that was also kind of a unique boss. And then we had some somewhat generic bosses, but this one actually gave us a unique boss against the 6th Great Worm, who we had heard of but didn't really know a whole lot about. It also had this special track, Yume Utsutsu, Dreaming by Daoko. So that was the boss theme versus Chthonius. Ultimately, what happens is the other does end up being sort of fully revived or fully resurrected at their peak strength, and the rest of the siblings fall in line under the other / Empress Zethia, with the promise that Empress Zethia is going to kind of bring peace to the land, but peace through fear, subjugation, oppression. So obviously not something that Yuden can abide, and Yuden wants to stand up against them, but he's no match for the royal siblings at this point. So Alberius, with kind of his last breath or last bit of strength, just how Zaina had saved the party previously, Alberius whisks Yuden away back to the Halidom, and we eventually learn the Halidom has some teleportation shenanigans kind of built into it, but we don't really learn that at this time. What we do get, though, is a new resolve from Yuden, a new determination, where we see this last image on the right of him getting his Gala variant, and at that point we know, okay, he's going to be summonable, he's finally going to get an alt. I thought that having Leaf there and the rest of the crew, it just felt like a clear juxtaposition against this other image of Empress Zethia and the royal siblings. So to me, this was a really sweet chapter. Not only the lore about 300 years ago, the battle against Chthonius, and then also this next story arc really set in motion. So let's move on to the next one on our list. So we had 10, 9, 8. This will be number 7. And that's going to be Chapter 11, 6-2, Annihilation Mode, or I think it's also maybe called Elimination Protocol when I looked over old footage. Of course, the wiki said Annihilation Mode, and all these stories are going to be preserved in the wiki. And I also have a whole playlist of all my reactions to the stories, whether they were recaps or real-time playthroughs. So I'll put a link to the wiki in the description below. And also, at the end of this video, have a link to that story playlist and also the final battle as a single video. But anyway, as far as Chapter 11, this one was really focused on the androids. It was kind of a regrouping chapter after we had that climactic battle in Chapter 10. And I have to be honest, the androids, it almost felt like a filler arc to me at the time. It wasn't the most exciting thing. It felt like we're opening up so many different plot elements. I just want to focus more on the royal siblings and kind of the main story beats. But this, at the time, I wasn't the biggest fan of, but looking back on it, that boss battle we got against Laxi, I think it was one of the most refreshing maps in the game. Once again, a very unique boss battle. We also ended up getting Laxi as a playable character. Laxi and Mascula became very beloved by the player base as well. A lot of people already at the time clamoring for Mascula. And that boss fight against Laxi even had unique music. So I think it's Ichiban Boshi First Star, which is by Daoko. That was the boss theme. All in all, I remember this being a challenge on very hard to take on that boss using my water team. I think that there were some exciting story elements introduced with the androids, like the maestro who created them, and we later found out about their larger relevance in the story of Dragalia Lost. So while this may have been a little bit more of a sleeper at the time, I think that boss battle and some of the longer-term implications were enough to elevate it to my top 10 list. So let's move on to number 6. This is Chapter 12, 4-4, Unyielding Ambition. And if I were ranking these in order, from the one I like the most to my least favorite, honestly, this might be very high up there near the top. This was a truly epic chapter. Just look at the amount of scenes that we had here, focused on a confrontation between Leonidas and Yuden. You can see them clashing in the form of Mars versus Midgard Sormer, or in the center, that battle of wills with the comic book or manga style drawing. And it's ultimately also an opportunity for the story to introduce yet another unique boss against Mars. These bosses did end up being implemented later on in things like Trials of the Mighty or Void Battles, but at the time was pretty exciting to get unique bosses. And also there was a moment where Alex got to confront Yuden, and she's kind of the person who saves, Alex got to confront Leonidas. She's kind of the person who saves Yuden, and it also kind of brings her arc to a fulfilling climax as well, with everything that she went through when she was in Valkaheim, working under Leonidas. But then, as if all of this wasn't enough, this grand battle, and remember at the time, even though people were thirsting for Leonidas, that happened a lot later when he got his Gala variant, more so, but yes, there were crazy Leonidas fans, but he was pretty despotic. I mean, he was quite cruel, villainous, so it felt like a real test of wills. But as I said, as if all of that wasn't enough, then we get Ferris swooping in out of nowhere, unleashing a horde of void dragons upon the party. And although this didn't technically happen until the start of chapter 13, Leonidas, having been bested by his brother, seeing the merit of bonds and the merit of teamwork and companionship with one's dragon as opposed to sheer alchemical enhancements, Leonidas is actually the one that helps fend off these void dragons and repel Ferris. So chapter 13 starts to introduce Ferris and Baron, the fifth royal sibling, and that takes kind of a different path that ends up being very important to the story, but at the time I was kind of like, what is going on with chapter 13? But chapter 13 follows this up. Just wasn't as exciting as far as the confrontations that it entailed, but did have a lot of lore. For me, though, this chapter 12, the story scenes, the boss fight, there's even some story images like of Mars that I didn't even choose to show here because there's so many to choose from in this chapter. It's got to be near the top of my list. So let's move on to number 5. That's going to be chapter 14, 4-4 to 4-9. The name of the chapter is Chaos in the Capital. All of these segments happen in the Inner Palace, which is kind of the final part of this chapter. And in this part, we have stormed the capital. So right off the bat, one of the things that excited me about this was this chapter introduced a lot of new map designs. We had interior maps where we're actually going into the castle. That was a pretty big deal for me as far as my enjoyment of the story was just, are the environs appropriate for what we're trying to carry out? And some of those interior maps were pretty sweet. They ended up being used later on in the Kaleidoscape. But as for this chapter, we storm the capital, we get into the throne room, we confront Empress Zethia, and essentially Yuden offers himself up on a silver platter as a willing sacrifice to become the host of the other, just for the sake of saving Zethia. If this were to happen, it would spell calamity, ruin for the whole world, but that's how much he wants to save his sister Zethia, that he's willing to sacrifice himself and everything else in the world just to do so. That doesn't end up coming to pass, though, because as Mursayadi, or as the others beginning this transference process, none other than Baron, introduced in the very last chapter, appears to intervene and essentially absorb Mursayadi. Baron seems to be a master manipulator of black mana. Little did we know the true extent of his power at the time, but just the fact that he was strong enough to completely suppress the other as a character who was seemingly introduced out of nowhere. It was pretty clear that Baron was a power player, and Ferris working alongside Baron at that. Ultimately, Baron and Ferris get away, but another set of characters appears. Volk actually shows up in this chapter, and we have a battle against Volk in the throne room. Just when we think the other has been absorbed, removed from the situation, we can save Zethia, the other's no longer inhabiting her, Volk appears, we battle against Volk, but Volk ultimately ends up leaving and taking Zethia to Nedric, Nedric being the leader of the Agito. So all this journey to catch up with Zethia, it's still prolonged as she's taken once more by kind of yet another party. So First, she was taken by the other possessed Aurelius, then she became possessed by the other. At this point, she's no longer possessed, but she's taken by Nedric. So the thing that really hit home for me this chapter, those boss battles against Volk were really sweet. He was a very exciting character to have introduced into the story because I just didn't necessarily see, like, the high dragons were not part of the story, even though the great worms technically are. But I didn't see our endgame bosses being so central to the story in this way, so that was really cool. But this chapter, I would say, is punctuated by this moment at the end, under the full moon here, where Zaina consoles Yuden. And Yuden is kind of able to reflect on his actions, that he was willing to sacrifice everything to save his sister. Zaina is here almost as like a proxy for Zethia, able to help him explore some of his emotions, and she's going to help later on in the story as well with Yuden's ultimate maturity and realization that he has to do things in a different way. The way that he's always wanted to do things is not effective. And then also very special in this scene is a special track plays. So it's called Case I by Lucretia. It's a really, it's just a really sweet track that plays in this moment. Very poignant and kind of touching. So overall, this chapter 14, this was another one that might be way up there near the top. Let's move on, though, to the next chapter on the list, or next moment on the list. And this one's going to be number 4. It's chapter 15, 1-1 and 4-4. I chose 2 from this chapter. They're just too sweet. The chapter name is Light and Shadow. There are these 2 scenes, respectively. The one on the top left being in 1-1 and the one on the bottom right being in 4-4. So the way the chapter starts out, before we even get the splash of chapter 15, Light and Shadow, appearing across the screen, before that even happens, we see Nedric standing over the body of Valix with this army completely eliminated on the battlefield. Nedric has subdued Valix, his entire army, and is standing over him. He places a mask on him to subjugate and control him. That's how this starts out. That's how we know the stakes and the Agito are not playing around. Like, they're on another level. To me, that scene with Valix and Nedric is just so iconic, and gives Nedric like a very menacing, very villainous vibe, right? When we first get Valix introduced. As the chapter goes on, we start to catch up with, along the northern border of Alberia, the full crew of the Agito, including Nedric, Kayan, Tartarus, Volk, Ciela, Ayahan de Toha, and Zethia, who's along with them, and Valix, who's along with them, now wearing this mask. There's a pretty clear power gap between Yuden and Nedric at this point, and even Yuden and the entire Agito. And we get this panorama, that bottom right image in 4-4, of all the Agito. To me, one of my favorite images in all of the story. It just looks so epic to see them all aligned like that. And ultimately, there's also some pretty big story implications here. It's not just the posturing of these 2 different groups against one another, but Nedric actually reveals that Yuden was adopted, and Nedric is the true 7th scion. It's something that he had previously kind of told secretly to Elisanne, and she had started to have some doubts about him because of that. But at this point, Nedric reveals it to the entire group, which is a identity-shaking moment for Yuden, where he has to think about all the actions that have driven him to this point, and why he's trying to save Zethia, why he's trying to do what he does. And ultimately, it's something that he ends up growing from over this next sort of arc with the reborn Void Dragons. But as Nedric is about to completely crush Yuden, we've been able to battle against Valix. We got a battle against Thor, and Valix, of his own will, breaks free of the mask and is actually the one who saves Yuden. So Valix ends up saving Yuden. Zethia decides she's going to stay with Nedric, and it is her true brother, and she's kind of staying with him to get more information, but also we're soundly defeated at this point. And it's ultimately Xena again who is able to kind of teleport the party away to safety in retreat. But this was just a cool chapter to me as far as setting up the stakes. We learned more about Yuden's origin. Ultimately, I feel like the arc to pay that off, the Fairy Kingdom, well, let me start over. The Grams to then the Fairy Kingdom to then the World Tree, that arc was very slow to develop for me. So no chapter from like 16 to 20 was one of my favorites personally. I think this is where the story started to really shoehorn in a lot of the Gala Dragons just to show them off in the story. We did get some development for our side characters through these Gala Dragons, and we did occasionally get, the Agito challenging us throughout this in different ways. It is when Not got her Gala form, so those are things I liked. But this definitely felt like a slower point in the story after we just got this tantalizing moment, right, in chapter 15 where we were right there. And then in chapter 16, we're starting to rebuild. The Halidom is in chaos because the prince, everybody now knows, or rumors started to spread, that he's not really a true descendant of the Alberian family. And there are good things in chapter 16, like Leonidas does show up, and we get Gala Leonidas. He kind of saves the day. He shows his leadership abilities. But for me, that whole segment from, traveling on the Grand Fiore up to Grams, etc., was a little bit on the slower side. So that being said, the next moment on my list that's in my top 10, this is number 3, is actually chapter 22, 4-4, all the way to 5-4. There's a lot at the very end of this chapter that I think is worth highlighting. The chapter name is Twice Sworn, and I'm picking us up here after we've already ascended the World Tree, and we've learned about the creation of the world by two beings known as the Origin and the Progenitor. The Origin being the dragon Bahamut, and the Progenitor being a human known as Xenos. So for me, why this was one of my favorite moments is there were not one, but two climactic boss battles that paid off the previous arc in this section of chapter 22. At the beginning of this section, Nedric and Yuden are joining forces to battle against Bahamut, and it's learned that Bahamut is being manipulated by some outside force. So first of all, on the left there, you see we get that boss battle against Bahamut. I forgot that this was actually in the story. I later, Bahamut was added to the Kaleidoscape, and I was thinking to myself, wow, I'm glad we can finally play against him. But this actually was in the story, and it has a unique song. So it's Light a Fire by Honoka Watanabe. That's the first thing that happens. Ultimately, even though we stop Bahamut, Nedric wants to reclaim all of Bahamut's power for himself. And remember, this is after Zethia has kind of taken on a portion of Bahamut's power for herself. So Nedric wants all the power for Bahamut. He wants to execute his plan, and his plan being, kind of disregard for human life and giving everybody the power to shapeshift, even though it may make it so they can't survive it if they don't have the constitution or fortitude to do so. He wants to kind of equalize things, create a world of perfect parity in his own mind. So we have to stop him. So the second battle is versus Nedric. It's got a unique track as well, Into My Soul by SPI. And just the fact that we got not one but two battles here, for me, that's one thing that I really liked about this. Also, at the end of our battle with Nedric, we have an intervention by Audric. Audric gets a Gala version. He intervenes, and even though in this moment he dies, he severs his chain of causality to do this, he is able to talk to his children, his two sons in particular, Nedric and Yuden, and get them to kind of work together and see eye to eye. Yuden, of course, being adopted and kind of not his true heir, and Nedric being left in the Fairy Kingdom to die, but having survived nevertheless. There's a nice moment of closure there for Audric, a character who I really like since his introduction. It's great that he got weaved into the main campaign. And finally, the way that this chapter ends is also a tie-in to some of the events that were happening at the time. So all of the events centered around Satan and Orga and the Apostles. This tied into those as well, because at the end of this chapter, we have to rush back to Graham's to deal with the aftermath of the Satan incident that took place there. So this overall for me, it's mainly the boss fights, but it's also that moment with Audric. I just really like this one. Okay, just a couple left. So number 2, let's move on to Chapter 25, 4-5, Proof of the Pact. This was one near the very end of the story. At this point, we've revived the primal powers of the Great Worms by going to Lefkos, the dragon graveyard, I think it's called, or the primal graveyard, something to that effect. The origin, Zethia and Nedric share the power of the origin. The progenitor has started to amass black mana in grams. I guess Satan was doing that, but the progenitor also started from grams, and Emil kind of fended him off. We were able to escape. We start to plan our counterattack by getting access to the primal great worms and then having the Auspexes unlock their powers as well. The story at this point really starts to escalate to a truly cosmic scale, and I think it's something that you see in other shonen series as well, but the fact that there's multiple arcs. At the very beginning, we're just setting off to get a sacred shard, and then we're chasing after our sister and forging bonds with dragons. And then our sister is an evil empress who's going to take over the world. But if that's not enough, we move on to the point that we're learning about the world's creation, and we're dealing with people that are going to radically alter not just Alberia, I should say, which is what Zethia wanted to take over as empress, but they're going to change the nature of reality by giving everyone shapeshifting. So things start to slowly escalate, right? But at the point where it's Xenos, we're dealing with multiple realities, Xenos wanting to annihilate or crush every other world of possibility other than kind of one supreme governing reality under Xenos' total control. So that's the sense of the stakes. We've moved to almost a cosmic sense where we're dealing across worlds and dimensions. Xenos' stronghold has begun to engulf all other worlds and eliminate possibility throughout the nexus of different worlds that are connected by the space between worlds or the other world. Xena returns to her world to retrieve her physical body in this story segment because she's struggling to unlock her powers of creation as an Auspex. Baron and the progenitor have access to this power of creation where essentially they can kind of undo events or basically anchor events. It's functionally like a rewind, but they can anchor things to make sure that they happen for sure in a world. But the Auspexes have access to the same power if they can just unlock it. Xena is the one Auspex who's struggling to unlock it, so she, along with Yuden, decide to go into her world to retrieve her body because she, in the main world, is just a mana projection. So they go into her world, and remember, her world is one of ruin, where Yuden became the Dark Emperor, where he became possessed by Morsayati. Baron did not intervene. He fused all of the Great Worms together into the form of Kronos. He persecuted his friends and allies and companions. He became completely evil, but in some sense, he retained an element of what makes Yuden Yuden, and that I guess he thought by kind of this dictatorial power that he had over everyone, he could also achieve peace. So there's a little bit of that explored here, but ultimately, when she's there, she confronts Dark Emperor Yuden. He even shapeshifts and to Kronos, so on the left there, that's actually taken from the raid event, but I wanted to show Kronos, so yeah, we do get to battle against Kronos in this chapter. And we eventually find out that Yuden is actually a puppet of Xenos. Dark Emperor Yuden, I should say, in this other world, is a puppet of Xenos. And he believes that Xenos' mission to snuff out all possibility is the only way to create lasting peace. So there's something there core to Yuden that, remains. There's a little bit of mercy that you want to feel toward this evil character, but at the same time, in order for Zaina to kind of unlock her potential and get closure, she actually ends up killing Dark Emperor Yuden, her brother in this other world. So that's the image on the right there when she's going to deal the final blow. She thinks that this will save and prevent many worlds from being destroyed because the other world, Yuden, is trying to do that, but it's actually too late. He's ignited a spark of black mana, and he sets in motion the destruction of many worlds of possibilities, including Zaina's home world. So it's really sad, but Zaina comments to the good Yuden, who's still with her, the prince, that, as long as I still exist, there's still possibility for my world. I'm the last memory of my world. And they ultimately return to the other Auspexes who are trying to fend off Xenos and Midgard-Sormer, Primal Midgard-Sormer. And at that point, they confront Xenos, but Xenos states that the chain of events that has already sprung into motion with so many worlds getting destroyed, those were sort of like chains on his stronghold, holding it back. Now that those have been severed, his stronghold, his one reality, is going to completely envelop all other realities. And so the chapter closes with Xenos saying, "Dragalia is lost." And you just get chills when that happens. And then, of course, we had to wait for the final chapter. And, of course, that is number 1 on my list. Just the whole thing. Chapter 26, Dragalia Lost. It's the final chapter of the game. It's truly epic. So I will definitely post a link to, like I said, all my story reactions as well as the final battle at the end of this video if you want to watch it, because I think that final battle in particular is the one moment, if I had to choose one, that I would highlight. It's called the Consummate Creator, where we battle against Xenos. But essentially this final chapter, all other worlds, I think even our world, has been destroyed, and we're sort of just in this nebulous space between worlds. It's warped. Everything looks like a mix of elements from different realities, almost like you'd see in an asteroid belt, just debris sort of spiraling, swirling together. And in this final chapter, not only do we have to deal with Xenos, but we also have to deal with Baron. We have to fight evil counterparts from dark worlds of possibility. So Baron, kind of laughing in the face of possibility, makes a point of saying possibility also means that you have to allow for the fact that you could be terrible. You could be a horrible person, a villain in a world. So he has us have to battle against our own worst nature in some sense. The Auspexes are able to use their combined power of creation to stop him. That's kind of what you see on the left there. And everybody in the party does get moments to shine where they're battling against themselves or past characters. For instance, there's a moment where Volk even actually saves Ronzel. Despite them having this mortal enmity, Volk saves Ronzel. And I think it's not exactly because he's a good guy in his world, but it's more so because he wants to be the only one to take out Ronzel. He doesn't want anyone else to do so. That's what it seems like to me anyway. But all of that is happening. It gives the side characters something to do. And meanwhile, the kind of core group is going after the progenitors, going after Xenos. What ultimately happens close to the end is that Mordecai appears with some critical information. Mordecai stating that he is a part of Xenos. He is Xenos' discarded heart. He is Xenos' heart thrown away because Xenos felt that it was no longer necessary. It was weakness. It held him back. So we learn the truth about Mordecai, but Mordecai, around that moment, sacrifices himself to save Ilya. And in his moment of sacrifice, he tells Ilya, I want to do this of my own will because you sort of taught me how to love. He was a spark. He was nothing before he came into the world and met Ilya. And in his final moments, he also recognizes something in Yuden. So Mordecai tells Yuden that Mordecai is the portion of Xenos' heart that accepts others into it, while Yuden's is the portion of Xanos' heart that gives itself to others. So at this point, we still didn't really understand fully what Yuden was, and in this moment, we sort of learn Yuden is part of the progenitor's heart, part of Xanos' heart, the creator of the world. So having realized this, Yuden is uniquely positioned for a final battle against the progenitor. He's able to kind of access the area in which the progenitor has locked himself. And ultimately, it's not just by himself that he does this. The progenitor makes several strikes against the party, but Nedric is able to fend him off for a while with the form of Bahamut. Zethia has her Bond Forge state now, and Not even gets a Mega Transformation cameo and talks about the importance of bonds and possibility and why Xanos will never win against them. She even helps to protect Yuden. It all culminates in a final battle, Yuden against the progenitor. Lots of cutscenes in that battle to enjoy. And ultimately, Yuden ends up victorious, severing the progenitor's connection from the world, but in doing so, also severing his own connection as a heart of the progenitor, or part of the heart of the progenitor. So he sacrifices himself in this moment, and as his final act, knowing that he has this power of creation within, he recreates the world anew. So the story concludes with an epilogue. We get to learn of the fates of various characters after the world has been refreshed. We see that Nedric is able to have a happy life as the seventh scion, not an outcast prince. We get to see some of our favorite characters enjoying themselves in a time of peace, bonds between humans and dragons existing, but all at the cost of our precious Yuden, our precious prince, our Dragalia that was a beacon for everybody. So in the final moments of the story, we see a silhouette appear as Zethia is racking her brain about something feeling missing, something feeling lost. And of course, the silhouette is none other than Yuden, so he's still out there in the world. He's still there. They're able to reunite. The story ends there, so we don't know much beyond that, but ultimately, I think a really satisfying conclusion to the game that spanned multiple chapters, multiple arcs, introduced lots of characters, lots of villains, fun boss battles. Overall, I would have to say this has to top the list for me. If I had to order these, this would probably be near the top. That epic moment where we see that cutscene of the Agito has got to be up there, along with Chapter 14, Chaos in the Capital, and the battle against Mars and Leonidas. Those are probably the highlights for me, but so many of these were exciting. Anyway, y'all, that is pretty much going to do it for today. So I'd love to know what your favorite moments from the campaign were in the comments below. Otherwise, just a couple days left of Dragalia Lost and Dragalia Foundry uploading videos. Thank you as always for watching. Take care, and I'll see you next time.